our wonderful guest is Mickey Strang. Mickey, tell us how it was being a military wife when you were over at China Lake.
Well, at China Lake, I was no longer a military wife. I was the wife of a civilian scientist. China Lake oh, has about it had at the time we went there 1/3 of all land area that the Navy owned in the entire world. This is 1,720 square miles of laboratories and test ranges. And of course, at the time that it was built in 1943, where would you find all of that amount of land for test ranges but out in the Mojave Desert for somewhat good reason, because upper Mojave summer temperatures, well, we were at China Lake at the naval, what was then the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake. Facility needed to be that large because there were the extensive laboratories and then the test ranges, so that you could test the weapons concept right there on site. But the upper Mojave Desert, well, China Lake was due east of Bakersfield, which was the county seat, and you had to cross the first edge of the Sierra. That was 120 miles to the county seat in Bakersfield. And the thing that made accepting a job at China Lake look desirable was, first of all, some of the laboratories were some of the finest in the world, and you could go from a basic science, pure science, and carry a concept clear through into a finished weapon and test it there. So you had the full spectrum of the work. And China Lake was established originally as a rocket base, largely a product of Caltech. During World War II, 1943, the Atomic Energy Commission also used a chunk of the base there for some of its early work with the development of lenses for atomic weapons. This had the fallout that at the end of World War II, General Groves was looking for a place to move all the Los Alamos facilities. And because Los Alamos there in New Mexico had a water shortage, among other things, and so the Navy offered General Groves China Lake as a replacement for Los Alamos. And General Groves came out and took one look at the place and said, "You are never going to be able to get world-class scientists and engineers to live and work here," and he turned it down. And so the Navy went out of its way to make it a desirable place to work. Well, of course, out there in the Mojave Desert, since they had displaced only 27 people in acquiring all of this land, you didn't have a lot of places for people to live. So the Navy built housing for the civilian employees right on board the base, and we lived in Navy housing all the years that we were at China Lake, which was and they went out of their way. The Navy ran the schools on board also, and the schools were absolutely excellent. They were paying teachers adequate salaries, and they had an exceptional bunch of teachers, so it was a desirable place for us to bring our children to go to school. The Navy housing, well, it wasn't glamorous, you know, it was adequate. We'd surely, over the years, lived it a lot worse. So,
How hot was it in the summer, Mickey?
It gets up, well, China Lake was 25 miles from Death Valley as the crow flies, provided a crow would be stupid enough to do it.
There you go.
It was 2,382 feet to be precise, and consequently it was cooler than Death Valley, 2 degrees usually. So if you want to know the temperature at China Lake, you look at the Death Valley temperature in the summer and subtract 2 degrees, and you've got China Lake.
Hence a desirable place to live, right?
Yeah. And then in the winter, of course, the desert gets cold. Your winter nights would drop down to 10 degrees or less. And, we have seen it actually down at 0 there. So we've seen it from 0 to 123 degrees. And you could have a 60-degree swing in temperature between, by the time the sun comes up in the morning, it might be 30 degrees, and at noon it might be 95. And of course, in the summer with heat like that, the top layer of asphalt on the street tends to melt, so your shoes stick as you cross the street. And it is just so nice to live up here on the Redwood Coast and no longer worry about if you're wearing flip-flops whether you'll suddenly find yourself barefoot in the middle of boiling asphalt. But,
you mentioned that you were no longer a military wife because of your husband's job. However, your husband was in World War II and the Korean War, so you really were a military wife from the beginning, and there's some overlaps here, aren't there?
Yeah, well, in a way, China Lake was where I began work as a Red Cross casework volunteer in service to military families. So I had a lot of interaction with the military that were stationed there. There were 5,000 civilian employees, of which at least 2,000 had college degrees, and more than 200 had doctorates. So, and they had about 1,000 military. Well, the military, the pilots and the highly specialized military were just as happy as they could be, but your average enlisted family was really very much at a loss there, because there was no public transportation at all. If they didn't have a car, they were stuck. And the commissary and the post exchange were small and not good. They'd have to go clear down to Edwards to go do a reasonable amount of shopping. But I did have quite a bit of interaction with military families because of the Red Cross casework. I was also a Navy relief caseworker. An awful lot of women went to work. Why, it was a pretty isolated area where the divorce rate was extremely high there for a fair number of years, because the men their work was absolutely fascinating. They worked all hours, no overtime, of course. I mean, the government doesn't pay overtime, or rather, there's very limited overtime that the government ever pays. But for the scientists and engineers, you go by the main laboratory at 11 o'clock at night, and the parking lot would be half full because there were all of these people that were, they were fascinated by what they were doing, and or they might get hit with a wild notion at 2 o'clock in the morning about something they were doing and would dash into to the lab. I used to enjoy talking to the guards at the main laboratory, the Michelson Laboratory, where a large number of the civilians worked, and the guards would talk about these scientists that would come dashing in their bathrobes and slippers, and because they did at 2 o'clock in the morning, because they just suddenly thought of something in whatever they were working on. And for that matter, John had been known to go dashing in because he was debugging a computer program, and he'd suddenly thought of the bug, and off he'd go. Well, it was a fascinating place to work in the people that were working there, because you did have world-class scientists and engineers, and then of course there were always a lot of the rest of us. But I finally went to work there, aside from the volunteer work and the public affairs office, as a writer and editor. That was really a fun job because I got a chance to meet and interview a lot of these people, and I did a lot of ghost writing for senior management and senior scientists, writing of articles for the open literature. So I had a chance to really interact with some fascinating people. The school system there, what kept us there, in good part also, aside from John's work being fascinating, he was as a mathematician, he was actually mathematically analyzing weapons systems, and it was a fascinating thing.
There was an extreme lot of advancement made out there in scientific discoveries, not only in weapons,
oh yes, but
in many of the nuclear reactions and their effect on different chemicals and what could be created out of that. That was a lab. The whole thing was a lab.
And one other things, for example, there are two things in the civilian world that are direct a product of China Lake. One is the light stick. You know, that actually got invented because one of the scientists there got fascinated by fireflies, and that they emitted a cold light. And the Navy was very good about, if you had an idea about something, they'd let you go follow it up. And you know, there are very few places, Bell Laboratories being the sole exception, the only place else where if you were interested in something, your boss told you to, well, go look into it. They were also very, very strongly in favor of education, and every civilian employee at China Lake was supposed to take a minimum of 40 hours of training in something every year. They didn't really care what you studied, because they figured that any knowledge that you had would be useful in some way in the laboratory.
And advance
the other thing that came out of China Lake was metric video. And what that boils down to is when you see the ball coming down in a tennis match and you see where it hits, that's a fallout of a China Lake development, because this started when they'd be testing a missile on an aircraft, and they'd have to send a chase plane up and film the test, and then they'd have to wait until the film was developed before they could tell how far from hitting its target the missile had come about, whereas they needed to develop something that could be shown in real time quickly. And consequently, they developed metric video, so that when you see where the ball goes and how a tennis match, you see it hitting, and it's instantaneous, and you have the result. And so the man that developed metric video, a friend of ours actually, he started in looking at something else and got interested in this, and this was encouraged. So there, from the military R&D, there were a lot of civilian fallouts. There was, for example, there at China Lake, there was a very active group of seismologists that were interested in study of earthquakes. And one of the China Lake scientists got interested in weather modification and developing how to fog clearance, and he was heavily involved up here in this area in the FIDO experiments that they are at the airport here in McKinleyville. Not only in FIDO, but also one that he called Project Cold Cloud, where he was trying to, if you had a fog covering an airport, trying to develop a way to make the fog rain out so there'd be a clear spot. And he was also my favorite mad scientist, in that, he'd dye his goatee green on St. Patrick's Day. In the process of working with weather modification, he'd gotten a bubble machine, and one time he heard there were a group of generals and admirals that were coming out to see his facility. He had his own little building out in the range, and he heard when they were going to arrive, he and his merry crew fired up the bubble machine, and they opened the front door of his building and were greeted by an entire corridor filled with bubbles. But people who are creative scientists just don't think quite like the rest of us do.
Well, with every test that went on there, every atomic test that went on
yes.
there was a multitude of minor tests for different synthetic reactions at different...
Yes. There were relatively few. The China Lake did not get terribly heavily into nuclear. They did have one range where they were having aircraft testing, throwing over-the-shoulder attack nukes. The range crossed one of the major roads, and there'd be a little sign up on the road to beware low-flying aircraft. You really wouldn't want to have some tourist car hit by an airplane.
Well, then the atomic tests were probably all at Area 51 then.
They were Area 51. They were not China Lake, although the bomb shapes were tested at China Lake with, of course, inert bombs,
Right.
Building X at China Lake was where they first practiced loading what I don't know what, I think it was a little boy. They see see what it would take to store and load this on an airplane. Area 51 would have been where the nuclear tests were. China Lake was, well, the only thing that the AEC did build the nuclear lenses, or the lenses for the nuclear weapons there, but that's an entirely different type of a thing.
Right.
And,
Right.
But it created an interesting problem in one way, and that, of course, anybody that worked there had to have a special clearance. It's always been a very high security base. On top of your regular China Lake credentials, you needed the special credentials to get into the area where they were doing the work with the nuclear lenses. They got a very officious admiral in charge of China Lake, who discovered that even though he was in charge of the whole facility, he could not enter the area where these lenses were being made, because it was an AEC facility, and yet there were busloads of civilians being taken out there every day, and shall we say he was not pleased. There was a fair degree of difficulty about it until a very sensible admiral came out from Washington and poured soothing oil on him.
A lot of people don't realize that even the most minor of a nuclear reaction caused certain infusions that they now discovered affected a lot of synthetics in many different kinds of material that we use today in industry and all kind of things. A lot of people think that those nuclear reactions were just for war. They created extreme scientific advancement because they had them contained, and different kinds of chemicals and things at different distances under different circumstances for every test. And because nuclear is in itself dangerous, it was highly supervised, highly difficult to get in, and highly secretive until they had everything done, because they didn't want the public out there in the way. A lot of people think that that was just war, and it was a lot of scientific development came out of that.
Well, that was one thing about China Lake. In order to get aboard, even to visit a civilian living on board, people had to go through the main gate and get a special visitor pass, and the main gate the people at the main gate would call and get in touch with the ones that they wanted to visit, and you had to okay these people in, and that's only for the housing area. They could not go anyplace else. And you had your pass also. The pass that you had to wear every day had to be worn above the waist, and where it was visible. Anybody over the age of 10 had to wear a pass at all times. When we had kids in high school, our housing was 2 blocks from the high school. The high school was on the other side of the fence, and they had to go through a guarded gate to go to school, to come back on board to get home.
Well, they had a lot of security for a lot of reasons, because they had to deal not only with the curious, but with the uninformed, and that's where the danger came in, because a lot of people were uninformed about what was going on, and they shouldn't be out there at all.
And if you have a test range where people have been shooting energetic materials for 20, 40, 50 years. You don't want to have somebody tooling down the highway and deciding they're going to go out across the desert and pick a cactus flower or something, because they might well stumble over something that was fired 40 or 50 years ago and still hadn't exploded.
Not good.
Not good. Definitely not
good.
And
a lot of people didn't realize it was protected for their sake.
When I worked for the Public Affairs Office, and whenever there was a test out on the range where you had radio, television, newspaper people coming up to observe, why, somebody from the Public Affairs Office had to escort them. Public Affairs would on the lead car, and you also, there were also going out across the range if the range was hot and there were tests going on. Since so many of the missiles were heat-seeking, why, you stopped at various places and then phoned range headquarters to say you were going to be driving down, you were at such and such an intersection, you were going to be driving down such and such a road, and they would tell you whether there was an airplane that was going to be doing some missile firing, and if so, why, you remained there until you were told that it was clear, because you didn't want to be going down the road and suddenly find yourself being chased by a heat-seeking missile.
Right.
That could spoil your whole day.
Literally.
One of the tests out there was definitely not a missile test. This gives you kind of a description of the upper range area when the astronauts were going to be practicing their driving their moon vehicle. China Lake upper range they decided was the closest thing to the landscape of the moon in the United States. So the astronauts came up and test drove their little lunar rover out there in the upper range, and they were going to be showing it off. So we had French television, German television, Japanese television, everybody that could grab a camera, I think, in the entire world ended up in that string of vehicles following the astronauts out to get a picture of them driving presumably on the moon, although it was at China Lake. But that does give you a bit of a picture of what the upper range was like.
It does.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.